Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, good morning. How's everyone doing?
Good.
How are you? I am well. I'm Attorney Sorrell Nassau. I have been studying history and specifically black history for about 25, 30 years, really longer than that, but it sounds good when you say 25 to 30. That lets you know exactly how old I am, but it does let you know I've got a little seasoning on it. Okay? But today I've been asked to speak on black history in Georgia as it relates to this area, in particular Fort McCallister. But you cannot tell the story of black history without telling the whole story of American history, right? Because blacks in America have contributed to American history. And our state is particularly unique. We are one of the 13 original English-speaking colonies, right? And an interesting thing about the 13 colonies is that not all of them started the same way. The northern colonies up in the northeast basically were religious areas. Oh,
I'm sorry, that's fell off the wall.
I guess this is a powerful speech. And those colonies in the mid-Atlantic area, the Virginias and the Marylands, they also had some religious aspects to them, but they were specifically designed for money, right? To make money for the investors, or the crown. The crown is the king of England. Okay? Also, when you get to the southern colonies, they too were designed to make money for Great Britain. Except for Georgia. Georgia was unique because Georgia started out as a place for the worthy poor and also to serve as a buffer for the Spanish colony, which was Florida. The Spanish, I guess the colony of Spain, which was Florida. And Spain and Britain had a really rocky relationship during that period of time, right? But the unique thing, well, I'll start this off with a trivia question. Of the 13 colonies, which was the last one to have slavery? Does anybody know? The last one. It was Georgia.
Yeah.
Georgia was started in 1733, established in 1733, and it primarily was a place, as I said, for the worthy poor of England, because back in those days, poor people got arrested and put in jail if they owed debts. And our primary founder of Georgia, who was James Oglethorpe, he was a very pious man, and he didn't feel that that was right. So they established the colony of Georgia to bring poor people over, to give them a fresh start, and to also serve as a buffer against Spain making encroachments into the British South Carolina area. So this is kind of a buffer zone, right? And with this worthy poor situation, they felt like, well, we're going to show them if they work hard, if they do the things that they need to do, it will increase their morality, essentially, right? So they gave people who came over here small plots. I think there were no more than, I can't be for certain, but less than 10 acres, right? And they wanted them to work them for themselves. They weren't looking to make a bunch of money like some of the other colonies above them, South Carolina and North Carolina. South Carolina was a very rich colony. South Carolina was probably the richest colony, the English-speaking colony during that period, right? And South Carolina's wealth was based on slavery. It was based on indigo production and, more importantly, rice production. We think about cotton when we think about the American South and the antebellum period, but just when we had the colonial period, rice was the king. Rice was the king. So here you have this very wealthy colony abutting Georgia, and here you have Georgia with these poor people who are sent over here to protect the assets of the wealthy colonies, but also establish themselves as yeoman farmers, basically able to farm enough to support themselves and, you know, have a little stake in what it means to be free and fear of being encumbered by being arrested and whatnot, but not enough to get rich, okay? So this system lasted in Georgia for the better part of 15 years. So I think that's pretty remarkable that the state of Georgia, which is pretty much the jewel of the Deep South, did not have slavery for its first 15 or so years, okay? But the problem was this: Mr. Oglethorpe being a righteous and pious man, it wasn't, and don't get it twisted, it's not like they had some great love for African American people, but they felt that it was the moral thing to do is to not have a slavery-based economy. And Mr. Oglethorpe was big on that, you know. But there were some people who were also governors of the state of Georgia or the colony of Georgia who reported to the king, who wanted that wealth. They're working hard on these little plots here in Georgia, and they're looking across the Savannah River, and they're seeing this opulence. These people sitting on their verandas drinking mint juleps while you have these slaves working this backbreaking work, right? But they wanted that money. They wanted, as the comedian Barton said, they wanted the yams. So they kept pushing Oglethorpe and the rest of the governors that reported to the king, hey, listen, you know, we can't make it in this harsh environment. We can't do this hard work that you guys are wanting to do and not make any money. It's hot out here, you know, and this is Georgia. We're below the net line, right? So it's like it's sticky here, you know, these bugs, you know, we can't do this. We need some help. And the Negro slaves over in South Carolina are doing the work that you guys are asking us to do, because originally they wanted Georgia to set up to do small things like silk production, right? So growing mulberry trees to have silkworms make, you know, silk fabrics and things of that nature. That didn't work. It wasn't a prosperous. Enterprise, right? Meanwhile, across the way, they see these people making excessive amounts of money. So eventually, after 15 years, Georgia switched to a slavery-based economy. And the reason why is because Georgia's environment or climate is very similar to the coastal climate of South Carolina. This is a subtropical climate, right? And this type of climate is ideal for rice production. Okay, so Georgia got in on the slavery business in the 1750s. I think it was 1751, okay? So after Georgia amended its charter to allow slavery, they came in, they started coming in, and they got the slaves from West Africa, okay? The way that the slave trade worked was it actually started in the 1400s. Think about it. Georgia did not get established until the mid-1730s and didn't get into the slavery production business until the 1750s. So this thing had been going on for over 200 years. They had got this down pat, right? And the way that the slave trade has been portrayed, I think, in the general public is kind of a misunderstanding, because these people were not ignorant rubes running around naked in a forest somewhere, right? This slave trade was exactly that. It was a trade, and these people had something to trade, right? The area that was popular for rice growing was from the Senegambia area, Senegal, Gambia, on down to the Ivory Coast area, right? And where my father is from, which is Liberia, West Africa, that area during the 1600s was known as the Grain Coast, the reason it was called the grain coast is because these people were well skilled at producing grains. Well, they had trade for years with the Portuguese and the Spaniards with rice production and other grain production. In fact, they grew a grain that was so good that the Portuguese called it the grain of paradise, right? It's the Melaguta pepper that grows in that area of Liberia and a little coast of Sierra Leone as well. So people knew what they were doing when it came to agricultural engineering. And once the slave trade ramped up, the people who had plantations, they grew rice and also indigo, they knew who they wanted to make those crops work here. Because rice is not indigenous to America. Rice was brought over here. It was the rice that became popular was an Asian-based rice, but the people who grew it came from Africa because Africa had its own rice. But it was very similar techniques, right? So the British who established these colonies, they didn't know how to grow rice, right? Rice didn't grow in Britain. But they knew who to get in order to make the money that rice production yielded. And that's where they went. They went to Senegambia, they went to the Sierra Leone area, and they went to what was the Grain Coast, which is again where my father was from, Liberia, right? And they knew that those tribal people, those people from those ethnic groups, were experienced in that production. So when the slave trade ramped up, they got a lot of those people from there. There's a website that tracks the voyages of slave trades, right? I think it's run by Rice University. If you get a chance, it's called Voyages. If you get a chance, look it up on Google. And that website shows you where these slave ships embarked and where they went to over the course of the transatlantic slave trade. And from this period from 1750 to about 1776 or so, the vast majority of the people that were taken from the Grain Coast were taken to South Carolina and Georgia. 1750, that's when Georgia got in on the rice trade, the slave trade, right? And the people that were taken over to here from there, along mixed with some other people who were enslaved that came from the southern portion of West Africa, which would be the Kingdom of the Congo, now is known as Angola, and also the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those people, they came from the south, but they didn't have that rice growing technology, but they were strong people, right? So they mixed those people with the people who came from the Grain Coast, and they set about doing what they did, which was economically changing this environment, as well as using their engineering skills to transform this land. As you drive into this particular fort, you see all those fronds, palm fronds, and those big trees, and those live oaks and cypress. That was the topography of this land. Those beautiful rolling salt marshes that we see, and those meandering little waterways, that was a production that was man-made. It was man-made by the slaves, because this was a swamp. This was a swamp in 1700s. And as swamps go, it was pretty bad, because what we forget about in the modern period of time is because Georgia is in this subtropical area, it had subtropical diseases. We had a lot of mosquito-borne diseases, malaria, yellow fever, all kinds of things like that. Malaria was very big in Georgia up until the first part of the 20th century, right? So with these people having had those experiences back home, their bodies were, their immune systems were better equipped to deal with those types of situations, right? So they went about clearing this land with all those dangers in mind. Subtropical, swamp, alligators, snakes, all that stuff. So in order to make rice work, you have to clear the land first to make it basically a rice paddy, right? So they had to remove all those trees that were indigenous to this area. They had to dig dikes to make the water flood properly in order to make a rice paddy, because a rice paddy requires a certain amount of water for a period of time to make the soil fertile, but it has to be drained out. But they had a system already designed to do that, and they transported that system here. And because of the inhospitable nature of this place, there were some advantages for people who came from West Africa, the Grand Coast, as I mentioned, which made it difficult for people who weren't from that area to live here 24/7. This place, as you know, is very nice in December, January, and February. You get around May, June, July, August, even with air conditioning, it could be rough. Imagine 250 years ago, no air conditioning, right? So what happened is these people were allowed to do their work on something called a task-based system. When we think of slavery, and think of those cotton fields and all these people working from sun up to sundown, that's called a gang-based slave system, right? Somebody's always on your back. Somebody's making you work, until you can't really see anymore. Okay, sun up, sun down, right? Well, the task-based system was different because people who were coming from basically a European background, they didn't want to deal with this if they didn't have to in the summertime. So they allowed these people to work basically on a task system. Okay, you need to clean these acres of land at this period of time. If you get done early, the rest of the day is yours. Just make sure that this work is done. And that's what they did. And they kind of left them to themselves. And because these particular enslaved people had a certain level of autonomy, they kind of maintained a lot of their own cultures. Even though all of them were from the same area, the slavers learned that lesson with something called the Stoner Rebellion, which happened in South Carolina in 1739. The Stoner Rebellion basically was a slave rebellion where people from the Angolan part of Africa got together and tried to revolt, tried to fight for their freedom. A lot of enslaved people, enslavers were killed based on that. The thing is the people that participated in the Stoner Rebellion, the leaders of the Stoner Rebellion, like I said, they were from Angola. And these Angolans were warriors, right? They actually had an army background. They had a lot of connection with Portugal, and even in that connection, there was a lot of fighting, right? So those people that ended up being transported to America were captors of a war. But they had those skills, those army skills. And because of that connection with Portugal, a lot of those people spoke Portuguese as well as Spanish. So with the Stoner Rebellion, the leader was this gentleman by the name of Jimmy. And Jimmy was literate because they had concocted a plan to raid the armory in that Stone River area, get the guns, and try to fight for their freedom, right? Jimmy had written banners with the word liberty on it. And they were going to these different plantations, beating drums, liberty, liberty, liberty. So their goal was to get to Florida. This is right as Georgia got established, right? Georgia was established in 1733. This thing happened in 1739. So Georgia was sparsely populated. But anyway, they put down the rebellion, okay? But the enslavers realized we cannot get all these people from the same area if they can speak to each other in their same language. So they would mix it. Some people from that southern West African region, the Angola area, along with people from the northern West African area that I mentioned earlier, which is the Grand Coast, which is Senegalia. They were mixed them together because they couldn't communicate easily in their own languages. But when they brought them over here and they set them down by themselves, they developed a new language. They created a new culture. And I'm looking at this one, and I'm looking at this beautiful, picturesque landscape, and I believe that that's the Ogeechee River.
Right.
Well, a lot of those people settled on the Ogeechee River, right? And those African people from these different regions of Africa who spoke different languages, once they learned English as their language, they also retained a lot of their culture from their prior experiences in Africa, right? But they mixed a little bit of what they knew from their area in the Grain Coast with a little bit of what they brought with them from their southern part, which is that Angola, Congo area, and they all kind of amalgamated and made something different on the banks of this Ogeechee River. And if I was a hip hop DJ, I would do a remix right now, right? Ogeechee River. Ogeechee River. Geechee River. These people ended up being known as Geechee people in Georgia. So they developed this African-based culture, but it was unique to this area, right? They maintained a lot of their Africanness, but they still had an American beginning because they were here with this culture, okay? So the Geechee people who populated this area, they did so much, right? They made this area filled with thickets into something that's livable today, right? And something that was profitable in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They made a lot of money for a lot of different people. I mean, a lot of money. But even when Georgia was trying to trend toward being a slave-based economy, there were still people of European descent who objected to that. And I want to give a special shout out to those people, right? The people who started the Ebenezer community. Some of you who are from this area, I'm sure you know about, over in Rincon. The Ebenezer people, they were religious Protestants as well. They came from the Salzburgers. They came from the Germany area, right? And one thing that they were about was morality. And they didn't feel like it was moral to own people. So they started the community called Ebenezer right on the banks in Rincon, right? And they rejected the idea of owning people, all right? Another group that was very prominent anti-slavery people were the Scottish Highlanders who established Darien, Georgia, which is a little bit further down in McIntosh County. Right? They felt like, we should not own people. Scottish Highlanders, they were hardworking, they were kind of fighters. We should not own people. So, I have to give them special shout outs because I think going against the economic tide of oppression should be respected and should be known about. Unfortunately, they were like minorities. The pool of having that amount of wealth was too great for the average person who lived in this state, right? So our economy started looking more like South Carolina's economy. South Carolina's planters started moving into Georgia and setting up shop, right? So again, they had these Geechee people clear this land, make these beautiful landscapes to the point where I can't remember the exact date, but the person who built Central Park, who designed Central Park in New York City, his name was Frederick Law Olmsted. Law Olmsted was probably the greatest architect of agriculture, of landscapes America's ever produced, right? Because Central Park is beautiful. Center Park was also a black enclave back before he did it too, but that's another story. But Mr. Olmsted came to the South and he made notes of his visits to the South. And one of the places that he came was here, right? He came to what was known then as Sterling Bluff on Richmond Plantation, right? Richmond Hill Plantation, right? And that was at that time owned by Mr. McCallister. Well, as a visitor of McCallister's property, Olmsted went to Sterling Bluff, and in his notes he said, when I saw this place, I got off my horse and got out my head, because I've never seen such a beautiful sight in all my life. I'm like, who do you think built that, Fred? This was not man-made. These people, these Geechee people, cleared that land, made Sterling Bluff what it was. So beautiful, this man had to bow his head in reverence. So, if there's anything that I would like everyone to take away from this, is that eventually I would love for these people to get their credit as being some of the greatest agricultural engineers that this country has ever known. Because you see the topography of this, just right here, you see all these trees and thickets. And, you know, this is then plays out for, human living conditions. Well, all of it was like this when they got over here, right? So they should get a lot of credit for that. Okay, so once those Geechee people had cleared this land and made rice production a going concern, we get to the point where the South decides that we don't need to be part of the rest of the United States of America. They're not honoring our request to get these slaves back. That's what George says in his letters of secession that they filed in 1861. They're like, we're seceding from the United States because we want to basically expand and keep slavery, right? And we have this law, that requires Americans to return slaves to their owners, and the northern states aren't enforcing it. So we want to have our right to own people on these forced labor camps without having any kind of interference from anybody. And that's what they did. The Civil War started in 1861, and they raided a lot of these United States armies to get the weapons, and they prepared for war. And they were smart enough to realize that, hey, if we're going to have a war, we need to be prepared for it. And one of the things that these slave owners did was create forts like this one. This one, in my understanding, was built in, I want to say 1862. It's called Fort McCallister because Mr. McCallister owned this land, right? And he donated it for the Confederate defense of this area. Okay? Now, Fort McCallister was built by those agricultural engineers that I told you about earlier. The slaves built this fort. Slaves built this fort. Now, at that time, we did not have a Geneva Convention, but just about anybody who knows anything about international law knows that forced labor and the protection of war is illegal. It's a war crime. But they didn't have those sentiments back then. They didn't care, right? So the people that made this land profitable for rice production were the same ones that built this fort, and they did it in such a way that it repelled every naval attack that the Union sent against it. Right? The Union had their top weapons at the time. I want to say they were called Ironside ships, I believe, or I can't remember if they did the monitor ships, right? Mm-hmm. And that was their top of the line naval ships. And they kept bombarding this place. In 1863, it repelled 7 different attacks. These things lasted hours. And none of them made a dent, or a considerable dent, and the construction that these beach people did for this fort. None of them. This fort was not taken until the ground troops overran this area, right? So when Sherman made his march to the sea, Sherman's troops were the ones that ended up overtaking Fort McCallister. And it was quick. This battle lasted like 15 minutes or something. And so from the actual fighting part, it was easy. But from the bombardment part, it was hard. So even though these people were forced to build this area for the protection of the Confederates, they did such a good job doing it that it withstood what it was designed to do, which was to stop a naval takeover. So with those types of things, that let you know how hard they worked and how smart they were in work. Okay, so with Sherman's advance to the sea, as they called it, one of the things that was little known up until I guess recently is that there was something called the Ebenezer Massacre. Right? And Ebenezer was that place that I mentioned to you earlier with the Salzburgers wanting that religious freedom. Right? They established a community in Rincon, had little churches, those little Austrian-looking churches, and everything, right? And when Sherman's troops made their swap from North Georgia down to the coast, you know, they freed a lot of people in their wake, right? So when they started taking over these large portions of Georgia, enslaved people realized this is our chance. This is our chance to get free. So when Sherman's troops marched in, they came behind them, right? When they came behind them, the crowd just grew and grew and said, look, we're President Lincoln, we understand, signed this Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That means that we're free now. We don't have to do this anymore. And our protectors are right here. We're going to follow them to wherever they lead, because wherever they lead, freedom is at hand. And that's what they did. So when Sherman's troops marched, these people marched behind them. But the problem was, the Confederates were behind them. See, the Confederates were led by this guy named Joseph Wheeler. He was the general for Georgia, right? And his troops weren't strong enough to fight the Union soldiers head on. They didn't fight them head on. They followed them in hope that they would make a mistake so they could capitalize on it. But again, the Union troops were powerful. They didn't want to fight them head on. So they followed the Union Army, cut this swath through Georgia. The enslaved people who were following them for their freedom was behind them. And Wheeler's troops were behind the enslaved people. So you know, imagine somebody who doesn't want to fight you, but knows that you're their enemy. They're looking at you and hoping that you fail in some way. Well, they did. But the forces that were led, the Union forces that were led by the general at that time who ran them, his name was Jefferson C. Davis, right? He was one of the unit commanders under General Sherman. And Jefferson C. Davis was essentially not a nice guy, right? He was known to be harsh with his troops. He killed some other Union generals, is my understanding, in some kind of duel or what have you. So he was not a nice guy, and he certainly was not an abolitionist. And he felt like these people that were following them were a drain on the mission statement, right? And their resources. So he wanted to get rid of them, but he didn't know what to do. Well, finally they reached this Ebenezer Creek. And if you've ever been there, it's not a creek. It's more like a small river. I mean, it's wide and it's deep. Okay? So he had decided that once we get to this Ebenezer Creek, and once we cross over, we'll make a decision about these, what they call contraband, these freed slaves, right? And the decision that he made was, we're gonna leave them on this bank, okay? So, once they get to the shores of Ebenezer Creek, he told the enslaved people, hey, listen, there might be some fighting up ahead, so you guys just hang back, let the troops cross, and then we'll let you guys cross. They built what's known as a pontoon bridge, right? That's a temporary bridge, right? So they built this bridge. They had all the Union troops cross first. They even put a guard back to make sure that these people stayed back. They had all the Union troops cross over the bridge to get to the other side. Then the guards that they had holding everybody back, they crossed. And then Jefferson C. Davis was not related to the president of the Confederacy. His name was also Jefferson Davis. Jefferson C. Davis, once the last Union troop crossed that bridge, he cut the rope. He cut the rope. And I want to remind you that these people were on this shore with the Confederates behind them. And once the Confederates realized that these people did not have the protection of the Union Army, it became a slaughter, right? These people were like, oh, what are we gonna do? We know what we're gonna do. So some of them, a lot of them actually jumped in the river trying to cross on the other side. A lot of them couldn't swim. So they ended up drowning. Well, I don't know drowning. They were drowning. I'm talking about hundreds and maybe even thousands of people. And when the Confederates got there, they started shooting. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. And the ones that they didn't shoot, they let their horses stampede. They were crushed by horses and by shooting. And the ones that did not get killed, they re-enslaved them. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so what happens is, with this massacre, that's what it's called. It's called the Ebenezer Creek Massacre. Once the northern papers got wind of it, it became an outrage. It became one of those moments that shocks the conscience, because the people up north were like, we're supposed to be freeing these people. Why are we allowing them to get killed by our enemies? Why are we allowing them to drown in such a horrible manner, right? It was really one of those gut check type moments. Sometimes a moment like that makes a nation take heed of itself. What are we about, right? So based on that bad publicity that happened with that Ebenezer Creek Massacre, and just I want you to remember one thing. Ebenezer, the name Ebenezer. Ebenezer means stone of mercy. And I just find that a kind of odd juxtaposition that all these people died in an area that is known for mercy, named for mercy. So the president of the Secretary of War at that time, his name was Edward Stanton, he knew that they had to do something for these people. So Mr. Stanton and General Sherman, they had a meeting in Savannah. And I want to say it was in early January, right about January 13th. So, because the Ebenezer Massacre happened December the 9th of 1864. They had this meeting in Savannah in one of those squares in 1865 in January. And what the meeting was with some of the more prominent African-American citizens, leaders in the Savannah area, right? There was about 20 preachers or so. And with this meeting, Mr. Stanton and Sherman asked these leaders, what do you want from us? And these folks was like, we want our own land. We would like our own land where we can till it and turn it and make it profitable for us. That's what we want. We don't necessarily want to just go back into society with nothing. We want the opportunity to participate in the American dream. So with that, General Sherman, a few days later, or 4 or 5 days later, he issued something called Special Field Orders Number 15, which basically gave all the lands on the southern seaboard from places from South Carolina on down to the tip of Florida, and about 30 miles inland to the formerly enslaved people as their own land, right? Titles to land, the opportunity to make a way for themselves, all right? So it sounded great, right? And when the word got out that this Special Field Orders Number 15 had given land to the formerly enslaved people, it came in droves, right? And one of the people that met with Sherman on that fateful day, Sherman and Stanton on that fateful day, was a guy by the name of Ulysses Houston. Ulysses Houston was from here. He's from Bryan County. Ulysses Houston was a Baptist minister, well respected in his community, and Ulysses Houston, once that order went out, that edict went out, Ulysses Houston took himself and about 1,000 formerly enslaved people to a place called Getaway Island, and they started setting up, they started building enclaves, and they started planning stuff, right? Unfortunately, Special Field Orders Number 15, which was signed by Abraham Lincoln, it didn't last. It didn't last. It didn't last because once Lincoln was assassinated, the next president, Andrew Johnson, with his racist self, he repealed Special Field Order Number 15. He decided he wanted to give this land back to the plantation owners that had it before. And mind you, they left, they ran, they cut and ran. Because they didn't want any parts of the Union Army. They didn't want any parts of that retribution, so to speak. Okay, so now you got these people who formerly enslaved and improved this property, they're living on it, they're forced to leave, okay? And Mr. Bryan, who was this prominent person I mentioned to you who set up this property on Getaway Island, he also became a politician. So when black people were given the right to vote in 1867, right? And they ran for office in great numbers that year and the following year, 1868. And Mr. Houston became the representative from Bryan County for the state of Georgia in the state legislature. Right? Him and another gentleman who lived in this area, whose name was Tunis Campbell. Tunis Campbell became a state senator for the coastal areas. Okay? Now, so both of those guys were part of what's known as the original 33. The original 33 black elected officials in Georgia were seated in 1868. But the problem was the remainder of the legislature, having to be white, did not allow them to take their seats. They did not allow them to take their seats because they said that even though black people had the right to vote, it did not mean they had the right to hold office. And they kicked them out of the legislature. Okay? So, unfortunately, right? But they didn't know, the other gentleman I mentioned, Tunis Campbell, they didn't know what he was about. Because this man was famous in his own time. He held the stage, he took the stage along with Frederick Douglass. He was a noted abolitionist. He wasn't from Georgia originally. He moved down here, he was from New Jersey. But in his time, if Frederick Douglass was Martin Luther King, he would be like Jesse Jackson. He was very well known and very powerful. So, even though they did not allow him to be seated in that Georgia legislature, he went straight to Washington. And he met with the president at the time, who was Grant, okay, Ulysses Grant. He met with him, and he met with the radical Republicans, right? Prominent among them would be Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, okay? So, by that time, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, with the exception of being a prisoner, and the 14th Amendment, which basically guaranteed birthright citizenship. Anybody that was born in America is a citizen. That was the 14th Amendment. That was based on the fact that there was something called the Dred Scott decision, which was decided in 1857, that said that black people are not citizens. I don't care if they're free or not, they're not citizens. Well, the 14th Amendment said no. Anybody born here is a citizen, right? But with those two things in place, still the state of Georgia's legislature would not allow these black people to take their seats. Well, when Tunis Campbell met with his friends in D.C., they asked him, what do you think can rectify this problem? He said, we need another amendment to the Constitution. We need an amendment that guarantees the right to vote, right? And that what came about as the 15th Amendment. And once the 15th Amendment was enacted, those people were finally allowed to take their seats in 1870. Okay? So this was Tunis Campbell who brought a lot about. And I have to focus on this man because he is such a powerful figure that has been forgotten in our society today. Because Tunis Campbell, when the Special Field Orders number 15 was signed, not only did Mr. Houston, Ulysses Houston, take over Skidway Island and establish a settlement, Mr. Tunis Campbell took over St. Catherine's Island in this area, Ossabaw Island, and Sapelo Island. And he established a lot of different settlements. And one thing he did was bring instructors, teachers down to teach these people who were largely illiterate. His main thing was teaching people, showing them how to be good, productive citizens, basically how to farm and make money farming, right? This is Tunis County. So once Johnson came in place and rescinded this special field order, he was smart enough to, at that time, had cut down a lot of trees and sold the timber to raise funds, and he established his own area in the McIntosh County area, right? And he became such a powerful figure that in addition to being elected the state senator for the state of Georgia in our state legislature, he also ran and became the Justice of the Peace for McIntosh County. And as a Justice of the Peace, that's kind of like a magistrate today, where they basically deal with small misdemeanor type laws and whatnot. He had the ability to arrest people. And he made a lot of racists nervous because he had a lot of power. Not only was he the Justice of the Peace, he also had established a militia of about 300 armed men to protect him because the Ku Klux Klan burnt down his house, tried to kill him, tried to kill his family, his wife, and his son, and did end up killing one of his employees. So he had this militia to protect him. That made people even more nervous. Black people with guns make people nervous. And that's what he did. So with him, his power base got destroyed because he kept getting brought up on spurious charges, right? He was charged with something called false imprisonment because he had, somebody came before his court who attacked two people in their home. He tried to give them a bond, but actually he didn't give them a bond, and he sentenced them to, I won't say 30 days in jail or whatever, and they said that was false imprisonment. So somebody else swore a warrant out against him, and they arrested him. And once he was arrested, they denied him a bond. They put him in jail. They put him in jail in the Savannah jail, which was condemned at the time. So it's my understanding that he was the only person in this jail that had been condemned because it was unhealthy. And this was back in shortly after Andersonville. So you can imagine how unsafe that jail had to be for them to put him in there. Anyway, he had a trial. The jury found him guilty. he was sentenced to a year of hard labor. So this man was probably in his 60s, late 50s, and never been enslaved. And they sent him to prison for hard labor, right? His case came upon appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. And once the Supreme Court looked at the charges, they're like, he didn't, these charges don't make any sense. There's no way he should have been convicted. And he was released, right? And the interesting thing about it is his appellate attorney, which, me being an attorney, I find this stuff interesting. His appellate attorney was a man by the name of Amos Ackerman. And Amos Ackerman, if you follow, I have a channel, right? A social media channel called Dirty South History. Amos Ackerman was the United States Attorney General who broke the back of the Ku Klux Klan shortly in the Reconstruction period, right? Because he brought a lot of charges against them and destroyed their movement to the point where a lot of them had to disperse out of the South. Well, when Amos Ackerman became a private attorney, he represented Tunis Campbell and was the one that got him free. So that is Georgia history for this area in a nutshell.
All right.
Any questions? You guys didn't have any questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I do have a little bit of follow-up information and some information to expand upon some of the topics that we spoke about. Specifically, in speaking about the Ebenezer Creek Massacre, I have some primary sources here. The first one I'd like to read from is from Sherman's March Through the South, Sketches and Incidents of the Campaign. This is written by Captain David Cunningham, retelling a story of a North Georgia slave named Austin. And this is an example of enslavement kind of flocking to Sherman's forces as they make their way through Georgia. So he quotes, much to his master Tannhouse's ire, Austin repeatedly preferred to sing the psalms rather than work. On one day in a drunken fit, House flogged Austin for worshiping after being instructed not to. Later that day, Austin took flight, traveling first to his wife, who lived on a nearby plantation, before setting out for refuge with Sherman's army. They say our saviors are coming, he told his wife, and I go to meet the bridegroom. Tragically, however, House apprehended Austin before he reached the army and levied his punishment on the spot. He tied Austin to a tree, pinning his arms back to fully expose his torso and unleashed dogs to attack him. When the dogs were through, he set Austin's feet on fire, but his wet clothes would not burn, so he wrapped a rope around his neck and suspended him from a local hanging tree. So that's one example of men and the kind of circumstances they were facing when they were fleeing their Southern masters or the Confederate forces trying to make it to Sherman's forces. Another source that I have here is from Somewhere Toward Freedom by Bennett Parton. They say they believed Sherman and his men to be the provincial force sent to engender their long-awaited emancipation. They hailed us as deliverers, one soldier recalled. Another reported that upon seeing General Sherman ride by, an enslaved man exclaimed, I have seen the great Messiah and the army of the Lord. The expectation did not meet reality. According to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Army had mandated to recognize and maintain what Lincoln called actual freedom. But that in of itself remained undefined, and whatever responsibility the Army may have had to enforce the emancipation, its legal responsibility ended there. According to Sherman's official orders, refuge was not to be granted unless a freed person could be of use to the Army as a cook or laborer. Freed people, however, paid little heed to Sherman's directive, and from young to healthy to old and infirm, the slaves fled to the Army. As many as 17,000 refugees at one point followed the Army as it marched towards Savannah. John Haidt, who was a chaplain in the Indiana 58th Infantry, witnessed the Ebenezer Creek Massacre. He described General Jefferson Davis in his account as a military tyrant without a spark of humanity in his makeup, an ardent pro-slavery man before the war, and has not changed his view since. On the pretense that there was likely to be fighting in the front, the Negroes were told not to go upon the pontoon bridge until all troops and wagons were over. A guard was detailed to enforce the order. As soon as we were over the creek, orders were given to the engineers to take up the pontoons and not let a Negro cross. I sat upon my horse then and witnessed a scene, the like of which I pray my eyes never see again. On realizing their plight, a panic set in amongst the freedmen who knew that Confederate cavalry were nearby. They hesitated briefly, and packed by a surge of pressure from the rear, then stampeded with a rush toward the icy water. Old and young alike, men and women and children, swimmers and non-swimmers, determined not to be left behind. In the uncontrolled and terrified crush, many quickly drowned. On the eastern bank, some of Davis's soldiers made an effort to help those they could reach, wading into the water as far as they dared. Others felled trees into the water. Several of the freedmen lashed logs together into a crude raft, which they used to rescue others they could and then ferry across the stream. While those efforts were underway, scouts from Wheeler's cavalry had arrived, fired briefly at the soldiers on the far bank, and left to summon Wheeler's full force. That was the Confederate general trailing them. Offers from the corps ordered their men to leave the scene, and the march was resumed. The freedmen continued their frantic efforts to ferry as many as possible across the stream on the makeshift raft, but when Wheeler's cavalry arrived in force, those refugees who had not made it to the eastern bank or had not drowned in the attempt were slaughtered or crushed by stampeding horses of the Confederate army. Those that survived that were then returned to slavery. And that's a first-hand account of that time. Another story that I would like to tell you locally here, to follow that, I know that was tough to listen to, is what's known as the Geechee Troubles. So the land across the sea here was owned by Mr. Chevy, who owned the rice mill. It's actually his mill that Sherman sits on top of to witness the taking of Fort McCallister here. Chevy himself donates a significant number of enslaved men to come build the fort here, as well as participate in the construction and burying of landmines out into the land to impede Sherman's forces as they make a land assault. One of the enslaved men here, who probably came from Mr. Chevy's mill, actually escapes across the water with the location of those landmines onto the Montauk. That information and location saved, an untold number of federal forces. And because he has experience on a steam engine from working at Chevy's mill, he's allowed to stay and work on the Montauk, and is aboard the Montauk when it sinks the Nashville, or Rattlesnake, the Confederate runner, out into the waters here. But as he talked about, we have a Special Field Order number 15, which grants all of the confiscated land, specifically the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along rivers 30 to 40 miles from the sea, and the county bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, were reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes now made free by the act of war and proclamation of the President of the United States. One of the stipulations in that order is anyone who contributed to, fought for, or associated with in any way the Confederate Army were to be stripped of their lands, and that land was to be divvied up and given to the enslaved men and women who worked those lands. But as we know, Lincoln is assassinated, and pretty quickly those white landowners start to take their land back. So this is an account of the Geechee Troubles from Karen Bell. Dr. John Chevy's Grove Point Plantation, whose estate consisted of nearly 2,014 acres, applied for restoration to his land in July 1865. During the war, Chevy had not only employed his slaves in maintaining Fort McCallister, but also reportedly engaged in building torpedoes for the fort. By the time of his return, 30 African-American families had received possessory titles to 245 acres of his land. John Chevy helped to reestablish the Rice Planters Association and refused to recognize the possessory titles issued to the former slaves. On the nearby Grove Hill plantations owned by William and Robert Haversham, 50 families had received titles to 641 acres. President Johnson personally pardoned the two Haversham brothers in September of 1865. So we have kind of a combination of simply just ignoring the possessory titles and the president actively pardoning the men who had engaged in aiding the Confederacy so that they could regain the titles to their land. On Saturday, December 31st, 1868, 2 years after Johnson rescinded Special Field Order 15, the Ogeechee troubles erupted. Dissatisfied with the imposition of labor contracts to replace their ownership, the leaders of the revolt, Solomon Farley, Paul Campbell, Jack Cuthbert, and Captain Green, began mobilizing the Ogeechee Home Guards. Deep in the Ogeechee woods, just before sunrise, 200 black men divided into military companies and armed themselves with muskets and bayonets. As the men marched toward the plantations, they met George Baxley, one of Chevy's overseers. The men lurched toward Baxley, surrounded him, confiscated his weapons, and struck him with the butt of a mullet. Baxley awoke after the men had left, found a canoe, and paddled to Savannah. The insurgents forced Chevy's to leave the Ogeechee Neck and bandied from the Ogeechee plantations to the Atlantic Gulf train station, a strategic rallying point where they proclaimed no white man should live between the two Ogeechees. They established their headquarters at Middleton's house on South Hill Plantation, constructed fortifications at Peach Hill, and established a watch on the main roads. In the late hours of New Year's Day, Solomon Farley issued what is known as the Ogeechee Manifesto. On the next day, January 2nd, Savannah Sheriff James Donner arrested Solomon Farley at New Hope Plantation, but when authorities attempted to transport Farley to Savannah, hundreds of black men in military formation armed rallies at Miller Station. The show of force led to Farley's release and Savannah's request for military assistance. This also led the insurgents to obtain legal counsel from Aaron A. Bradley, a labor activist who had himself escaped slavery in Georgia in the 1830s and studied law in Boston. However, the insurrection would only last 2 more days. On January 6th, funny, I find that to be a little funny. On January 6th, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Companies A and I, led by Major Sweeney, arrived on the Ogeechee Neck and gained possession of the plantations. For 9 days, soldiers aided civil authorities in arresting 143 individuals. Solomon Farley could not be located by the officials. In the end, 6 men were found guilty of insurrection and sentenced to 5 years hard labor in Milledgeville. However, Governor Bullock issued immediately an amnesty proclamation which absolved all 6 men of their charges. So, funny enough, in the Ogeechee troubles, no one died. They never killed anyone, both in their taking back over the land and the Savannah law enforcement kind of immediately backing down and going okay and calling for the military. Or in the arrest, no one ever kind of exchanged gunfire, although they were armed. And I find that interesting that it was an oddly peaceful insurrection. The last thing that I want to kind of expand upon is discussing that the fort was built with black labor. It was manned with black labor, and often when you see reenactments or Civil War movies where there are battles, I'm losing the word, the enslaved soldiers or the
Conscripted soldiers?
Conscripted soldiers, yeah. Conscripted soldiers are left out of that story. So both in the Battle of Fort McCallister as well as most battles in the Civil War, there were black men on both sides of those battles, and those stories are often lost. The other thing I would like to acknowledge is that there is this wall of 1865 when we're doing research on the African American history here where unfortunately their stories just aren't documented. And where we may find stories of black men, there are even less stories of black women. And so just because we don't have those stories or not able to tell those stories doesn't mean that they weren't there. It doesn't mean that they weren't contributing. It doesn't mean that they weren't fighting. It's just that they're relegated to a more oral tradition. And so, we're hindered in that research. But I do want to acknowledge that there are those stories there that we're not able to access now. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
I just want to say for those going into the fort too, is that with the building when crossing the bridge, going over the bridge into the fort, you have a few steps where you step down into the fort. From that level, you enter the fort from the bridge there down to going down those stairs there. All of that is below the ground level, and all of that's had to be dug out. So you're really going to see how much of that earth has had to be dug out and had to be carted out and used to build up that mound when you actually walk into the fort and kind of see that. A lot of times on our tours, we try to give an example by having the group stand on the upper level and us stand below and see how much lower we are than you. All of this earth and dirt had to be completely dug out manually. So just that's worth noting when checking out the design of the fort and looking at some of the engineering there as well.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate Mr. Nassau coming out. And I really enjoy having you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.